So in our last class, we talked about the way that Eusebius conceived of a Christian Roman Empire and used the figure of the Emperor Constantine to argue for how that Christian empire should be run. We talked about how this picture of Constantine that Eusebius creates is an ideal that covers the reality of the empire and what Constantine actually did, but it deliberately distorts it so that the picture looks more towards what the empire, as Eusebius imagined it could be, would look like, rather than what the empire under Constantine actually did look like. And so, not surprisingly, the Christian empire that emerged in the 4th century looked very different from the one that Eusebius imagined. And so, in this class, we're going to spend some time looking at the real Roman Empire of the 4th century. And we'll get to know Augustine, who's one of the period's most famous people and products of this system. Now, Augustine is a fascinating figure. He's a towering intellect, a tremendously charismatic person, and a master at building and using political relationships to advance his interests. And he was also a figure who was born at exactly the right time to use these talents. Because Augustine came from provincial nobility, but not higher nobility. He's the son of a member of the upper middle class in a not particularly important city along the coast of North Africa. And in the 1st or 2nd century, Augustine's talents would largely have been wasted. He would have been stuck more or less in his city and would have struggled to make a name for himself beyond that city. So he would have been comfortable, perhaps even wealthy, but he would be anonymous, like the countless hundreds of millions of other elite Romans living in the provinces in the 300 years between the reign of Augustus and that of Constantine. These are people who are similarly gifted, but lack the opportunity to really showcase these gifts on the imperial stage. But fortunately for Augustine, he was born in the 4th century, in the empire created by Constantine. And so now you're probably immediately thinking that Augustine's success came about because Augustine was a Christian at the time that Constantine had begun to Christianize the Roman world. But this would be wrong. Because for people actually living in the decades after Constantine's death, the legacy of the first Christian emperor was as much an economic as a religious one. And this is because Constantine continued the project of building a more centralized and efficient imperial government that was first begun by the Emperor Diocletian in the last decades of the 3rd century. And when Constantine died, the project was near completion. It had created many new provinces, many new government departments, and an expanded imperial bureaucracy made up of perhaps 32,000 new government jobs. And another 32,000 or so were added by an expansion of the support staff created to make sure that an expanded army of 500,000 people had adequate supplies. And this extended to Greek and Roman provincial aristocrats participation in an imperial administration that had once been run primarily by a really narrow group of Italian senators and their households. So provincial elites like Augustine, whose horizons had once largely been limited to the city councils of their hometowns, could now aspire to positions that brought greater responsibility and honor on a much bigger stage. And these positions paid well. So bureaucrats, lawyers, teachers, people belonging to this new imperial elite could expect compensation either in a new gold coin called the solidus, and this is the solidus of Constantine on the slide, that could be readily converted to gold, or if you accumulated enough of it, actual storehouses of gold in your possession. So this is the Hoxne treasure. It's part of the property of a wealthy family, and these are actual gold ingots. And these gold ingots actually were held by private citizens, some of whom worked in these government positions. Scholars have taken to calling the 4th century an age of gold because of the way that the creation of this new gold solidus enabled notables of the empire to dream about, create, hold, and consolidate massive fortunes. So we hear of private citizens who lived in houses that resembled small towns, others who paid for public games that cost 1,200 or even 4,000 pounds of gold, and still more who kept locked private storerooms full of these 30-pound gold ingots. So here's a description of one of these households. This comes from the historian Olympidorus, and he says, "When you go to Rome, each of the great houses of Rome contains within itself everything a medium-sized city could hold. A hippodrome for racing horses, a forum, temples, fountains, and different kinds of baths. Many of the Roman households received an income of 4,000 pounds of gold per year from their properties. And because of the reforms of Constantine, the ability to participate in government and get access to these gold paychecks was extended to all who were capable and lucky enough to be noticed. And this made the act of getting noticed by imperial officials essential. Many people wanted these imperial jobs, but the early 4th century state didn't always have an effective mechanism for identifying new talent. And so young men seeking these positions in imperial administration depended on patronage networks of teachers, family members, friends from school, and friends of friends to bring their particular combination of skills and connections to the attention of the right imperial administrators who were hiring. And by the mid-4th century, teachers are regularly writing letters to imperial officials to place their students in governorships, to get them jobs on an administrator's staff, or to secure teaching positions for them. And emperors began to recognize the important role that schools now played and started to pay closer attention to their activities. So in the year 362, the Emperor Julian issued a law requiring that all teachers in the empire register with him so that he could ensure that they were of good enough character to teach these future civil servants. In 370, for example, Valentinian and Valens ordered the Office of Tax Assessment to compile an annual list of the students in Rome and elsewhere in the empire. And the purpose of this, as this law establishing this institution says, the purpose of this is to be sure that we may learn the merits and education of the various students and may judge whether they may ever be necessary to us. Now, the necessary to us is the key part of this, because the goal of this law is to basically put together report cards of students studying in all of the cities, the major cities of the empire, so that students who are doing well may actually be contacted and brought into the administration that needs quality people. So this reflected a reality in which education and imperial service became more closely linked. And this had important implications for the way the schools worked. Schools continued to provide students with a grammatical, rhetorical, ethical, and literary instruction that had long been a hallmark of ancient education. Beginning in the 4th century, however, they also began to offer a sort of professional training. Teachers of rhetoric, like those under whom Augustine studied, trained their students to argue effectively and appealed to magistrates to give them standing to argue cases in court. This was an important stepping stone in an administrative career, and most young men who wanted these well-paying jobs saw training in rhetoric as essential. The schools also trained the young, aspiring members of the elite how to behave and build relationships with one another. So teachers, their teaching assistants, and older students in the school ran initiations of newly arrived students, they organized communal activities, and they encouraged students to publicly support their teacher. And as Augustine describes in the Confessions, students lived together, they partied together, and they participated in regular mischief like brawling in the streets and kidnapping newly arrived young men. And for the generation of men growing up in the early 4th century, the schools offered an unprecedented opportunity to embark upon careers whose impact extended beyond the confines of their home city. And this is why Augustine was fortunate to be born at this moment in time. It was a moment when someone like him had a chance to really shine across the empire, when in the early centuries, the chances he would have had to do this would have been really confined and much, much more difficult. So the opportunities for wealth, prestige, and fame across the empire were so great in the 4th century that they also began to provoke something of a backlash. Because by the 360s and 370s, 3 generations of elites had taken advantage of these opportunities. And the grandchildren of Constantine's generation began to question whether the wealth, power, and high offices that this system had created were really admirable goals. And as wealth and success became widely available, they came to be taken for granted. And so some elite youths of the 360s then became something like the middle-class children of the 1960s and began to think about whether the rat race was worth it. They began to look for something more meaningful than a life working for the man. And this is Augustine's generation, and this is the very type of question that Augustine would ultimately confront. What is the meaning of what I'm trying to do? And is all of this work and all of this monetary and wealth and social prestige really worth it? And so that means it's worthwhile for us to pause for a few minutes and see what were the alternatives. Because we can, I think on some level, understand why people like Augustine would be pursuing wealth and reputation and career opportunities in this 4th century world. But what's the alternative? Well, the big alternative to Christian youths was that of Christian asceticism. And so this is St. Antony. The way that St. Antony described himself was as an ascetic philosopher. Ascetic is a Greek word that comes from the word ascesis, which means discipline. And for Antony, the practice of ascetic philosophy meant living on his own and working within the space of himself to master his passions and live a life of pure Christianity that allowed his soul to transcend the concerns of the world and ascend to a position where it was in communion with God. This might sound very, very strange to us. What Antony did was he first moved to the edge of his village, then he moved into the desert, and then he moved into the deep desert, and increasingly trained himself in more and more rigorous ways to endure physical deprivation and also a life of intense Christian contemplation. By the middle of the 4th century, what Antony was doing had become the height of a kind of counterculture, because ascetics were in every way the opposite of the successful elites of the Constantinian Empire. Many ascetics, especially the most prominent ones, were actually children of privilege. Antony himself came from a family that owned vineyards and orchards and estates in his Egyptian town. But they gave these things up. Ascetics gave up their family property. As ascetics, they had little or no property. They held no offices. They wanted no political power. They were nobodies in the social structure of the Constantinian Empire, but this was by design. And many of them gave up things that had at one point made them somebody so that they could become nobody. So instead of pursuing the things that made you successful in worldly terms, they just pursued service to a Christian God. Now, contrary to what's been argued by some people, Christian ascetics are not new in the 4th century. Forms of Christian asceticism, though not quite this extreme, have been around since earliest Christianity. But before the 4th century, they tended to be people who stayed in town. They would live in town, they would go to church, they'd maintain a level of involvement with their families, but they were, in a sense, very committed Christians. And so they're symbolically important figures, but their voices don't matter as much as a figure like Antony. But a series of developments in the 4th century in Egypt shifted the way these ascetics were perceived. So these developments included the gradual emergence of ascetics who practiced, like Antony, deep in the desert, the development of community-based monasteries where ascetics would take their practice from the individual level and bring it together in a communal setting so they could each support each other and make asceticism something that they do better because all of them are doing it together. And eventually, a growing interest among Egyptian church leaders in recognizing these ascetics as people who are very important in how Christianity and Christian theological arguments work. But one of the key moments in this process was the composition of the life of Antony by the Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Athanasius. And this masterpiece that Athanasius wrote had a host of interrelated purposes. But one of its most important features is its marking of Antony as a figure whose ascetic accomplishments far exceed those of town-based Christian ascetics. So Athanasius' narrative of Antony's life begins in a world in which ascetics exist only within the structures of village life. When Antony decided to embrace an ascetic life, he began his training by finding, watching, and imitating an old man in a neighboring village who had trained in the ascetic life from his youth. Now, once Antony had learned all he could from this man, he moved on to see and learn from others like him. So he visited each of these men, observed their practices, and carefully considered the advantage in discipline that each man had in relation to what Antony already knew. And then gathering the attributes of each of them to himself, Antony returned home. So in Athanasius' telling, Antony's achievements went beyond assembling all of the existing best qualities of the ascetics who lived in Egyptian villages. Once he'd learned and mastered all of these existing techniques, Antony pushed beyond the physical borders of the village and the spiritual limits that village life had set. And he moved first to a tomb on the fringe of his village. Then he went to an abandoned fortress in the wilderness outside of town. And then Athanasius explains, he withdrew deeper into the desert 3 more times, moving further and further from settlements and pioneering new spatial frontiers in ascetic practice. And as Antony expanded the boundaries of ascetic life, what we hear is colonists, ascetic colonists, followed him into the tombs and deserts outside of Egyptian towns and cities. And so this is the monastery of St. Antony in the eastern desert in Egypt. It's, again, as you can see, extremely remote. And yet, because this is where Antony settled, followers and disciples came and joined a community organized around the principles of Antony. Now, Athanasius makes clear that his Antony surpassed previous ascetics not just through the physical distance from settlements that he set, but through his ability to completely disentangle himself from the rhythms and demands of village life. So throughout the life of Antony, Athanasius systematically breaks down the ties that linked Antony to the people with whom he shared relationships and the communities in which he lived. The very relationships that earlier generations of ascetics would traditionally have maintained, and the same ones that bound the ambitious youths of the post-Constantinian Empire to their schools, jobs, and social networks. So when Athanasius first introduces Antony, he makes it clear what Antony is giving up. He describes Antony as the child of well-born and prosperous parents who had abundant possessions and controlled over 200 acres of fertile farmland. So this amount of land would make Antony legally a member of the elite, a member of the city council in most Egyptian cities. But Athanasius makes clear that Antony didn't want this. He wanted something different. And so Athanasius tells us that Antony shed all of the obligations that went along with elite life. He gave up on all of the rewards that being a member of the elite could give him. And instead, he transferred his property and pursued God and God alone. Now, a 4th century audience would recognize immediately how revolutionary this decision was. According to Athanasius, Antony had turned away from all of the things that elites wanted, and instead he deliberately chose to have a different, more rewarding kind of life devoted especially to the service of a Christian God. This was then a Christian answer to the appeals of the Constantinian Empire. Christians who did not feel like they were getting what they needed from the pursuit of wealth now had an alternative. They could stop chasing money and fame and embrace God. And because of this, Athanasius' literary portrait was an immediate bestseller, because it pointed to something that had not been available to Christian youth before. It pointed to an organized alternative to the rat race that they were undergoing. And because of this, the life of Antony proved wildly popular almost immediately. The text was published around 360. Latin translations of the Greek text appear quickly, the first coming perhaps a couple years after the Greek text, the second as early as 365 or 370, and then imitators also sprung up pretty quickly. So in 375, the future St. Jerome wrote The Life of Paul, a fictional, clumsy Latin imitation of the life of Antony that mentions both the Greek text and Latin translation, and creates a fictional ascetic who is just a little bit older than Antony so that maybe Jerome can get some fame as well. In 380, Gregory Nazianzen, who was then a bishop in Constantinople, began a sermon on Athanasius' holy day with the wish that he might someday be able to write something like the life of Antony. This is because the life of Antony captured the literary imagination of this generation, but it did more. It also inspired actions. And so Augustine himself tells us a story about the power of this text. He tells us about 2 bureaucrats who picked up the life of Antony while killing time outside of the city of Trier. One of them, we're told, began to read the text and was so fascinated and thrilled by the story that he conceived of the idea of taking up the same kind of life for himself and abandoning the world before he'd even finished reading. Now, this bureaucrat, who some people have speculated may even have been St. Jerome himself, turned to his friend and said, I have torn myself free from all of our ambitions and have decided to go and serve God. And he did this because service to God was glorious and the reward was great. And so these two imperial courtiers gave up their jobs, abandoned their imperial careers, gave up their salaries, and instead went off and tried to serve God in the way that Antony had laid out. Now, Augustine tells us this story in the Confessions because, in part, he lived a version of it. Augustine, like the courtiers in Trier, had fought long and hard to make it to the top of the 4th century imperial system. And once he reached the top, he was struck with a profound bewilderment. Like those courtiers, he was looking for something with more meaning than the world of riches and reputation. And there was a simultaneous sense of loss and longing that seized Augustine, and it was only quenched when he, like the courtiers of Trier, decided to drop out of the rat race. And the Confessions is ultimately the story of that decision. But to understand that decision and where the text comes from, we have to step back to appreciate where Augustus is coming from, how his background contributed to put him in a position where he might want to walk away from these achievements, and how we get to the point that the Confessions described. So Augustine himself was born in 354 to one of those upper middle class families whose children were taking such good advantage of the opportunities offered by the 4th century empire. He was born in Thagaste, and you see on this map Thagaste. So he was born in Thagaste, a small city in Asia or in North Africa, and his father was a man named Patricius, a pagan member of the local city council. The Confessions gives you the impression that Augustine's father was poor, but this isn't the case at all. Now, Augustine's father did not probably have storerooms full of gold bricks, but he's also a person who owns land, owns slaves, owns a townhouse, owns farmland outside of the city. He's probably in the top 95% of wealthiest Romans in the empire, maybe even the top 99th percent. And he enjoyed significant privileges because of this. And so Augustine is, despite what he says, a child of privilege. Not immense privilege, but very much a child of privilege. Now, in some ways, we know both more and less about his mother. The Confession says a whole lot about Monica, Augustine's mother. She's framed as a devout Christian and a bit of a nuisance who is constantly nagging Augustine about going to church, arranging his affairs, and even setting up his engagement. And while we know quite a bit about her personality, we don't actually know much at all about her background. It's reasonable to assume, though, that Monica was of the same social background as Patricius. This is why they would have been married. And Augustine's early childhood then would have been consistent of what one would expect of this type of upper class, full stop, parentage. He began his literary education around age 6. Around 13, he moved on to study rhetoric. But even at this age, Augustine had already showed himself to be something special. And because of this, his parents began saving money to send him to better schools than his hometown of Thagaste offered. They are putting him on track to join that imperial rat race. Augustine even sat out 1 year of formal schooling so his father could put together enough money to pay for Augustine to go and study in Carthage, the second largest city in the Western Roman Empire. Augustine also developed a relationship with a man named Romanianus, one of the richest citizens of Thagaste, who seems to have essentially sponsored Augustine. And in a way that was typical of the later Roman world, Romanianus did this because he was investing in Augustine. And this is, I think, on some level, something that's difficult for a lot of us to understand. What Romanianus realized is Augustine is a potential commodity. He's a figure who, if he actually does get the right kind of training and connections, he will be immensely useful to Romanianus in the future, because Augustine will be able to serve as an advocate for the sorts of things that Romanianus might like advocated for. He will develop strong relationships with important people, probably on the imperial level, and Romanianus could really take advantage of that. What Romanianus was doing was he was paying for Augustine's education because he saw in Augustine great potential and the possibility of capitalizing on what Augustine achieved to enhance his own profile and his own influence. And the same is true of other people. As Augustine matured, he picks up a host of other people who are looking to follow him up the social ladder. They too understood what the natural talent of someone like Augustine meant in the 4th century. This is someone with incredible skills who is on his way to a position of incredible importance. And these people wanted to build relationships with him and have him in their debt because they wanted to go along for the ride. Now, while Augustine was getting this training, though, he was also trying to figure out where in the crazy world he fit and what in this crazy world was actually true. So he tells us in the Confessions that he began reading the Bible, but put it down after he found the style of it to be too crude. And this, of course, made some sense. The Bible he was reading was a Latin translation of the Greek text, and we know this translation. This translation is a bad translation. It's both a bad rendering of the Greek, and also it just doesn't read well. St. Jerome's Vulgate, the Latin translation that would be used throughout the Middle Ages, it didn't exist, it hadn't been started, and so when Augustine actually started reading the Bible while he was in school, he's reading a bad text that would not seem to anybody with a literary education to be a particularly sophisticated thing. And this is important because Augustine is spending all of his time while he's studying looking at beautiful language and learning how to compose beautiful language. He's focusing on the study of rhetoric. And so nothing was more important to Augustine at this time than good, understandable, and attractive Latin. And he literally spent nearly every waking moment of his days focused on good, understandable, and attractive Latin. And so when he read the Bible and the Bible's Latin was terrible, he came to the conclusion that what was in it was also terrible. So instead, he began looking for other sources of influence, other sources of intellectual direction, other sources of truth. First, he embraced Platonic philosophy, but ultimately, he came to embrace a set of teachings that are associated with this man, a man named Mani. This is a set of teachings called Manichaeism. Now, Manichaeism is something that would hold on to Augustine's mind for the better part of 10 years. And it's based on a set of teachings that are put together by Mani, who is a Persian teacher, where what Mani did was he blended ideas from Christianity and traditional Iranian Zoroastrianism. And a couple of the things most clearly distinguish Manichaeism from other faiths, the first is that there's an extreme dualism in the world. There is good and there is evil. There are particles of light and dark. And these particles, in a sense, darkness and light, are continually at war. And the followers of Mani have, in a sense, an obligation to try to regroup and bring back together the particles of light that had nearly been destroyed by the particles of darkness. And so when dark initially defeated light, the particles of light were scattered throughout the world. And the most dedicated Manichaeans, who are called the elite, would travel around the world, teach, and be housed by regular followers of the religion. And all of the followers of this religion were, in essence, working to restore the power of the particles of light. Now, the elect in Manichaeism are ascetics. They don't have property of their own, they don't have any wealth, and they've devoted their entire life to the faith. They ate a special diet, which was made up of foods that supposedly contained particles of light. And the thinking, at least, that when they ate these foods, the particles of light would pass through them. They would be released into the world through when they went to the bathroom, and the particles of light would then regroup, and gradually, over time, the world would become a better place because of this. Now, another aspect of Manichaeism is also important to understand. When Mani set this up, he set it up with the explicit idea that this was supposed to be a world religion. And by the early Middle Ages, it had succeeded in doing this. There were Manichaean communities that stretched all the way from Europe to China, and all around the Silk Road, there are Manichaean communities across Central Asia. And so this was, in some ways, the first deliberately constructed world religion. Now, the faith as a whole, because of this, proved pretty popular. There were Manichaean missionaries, there was outreach, there was Manichaean teaching, and Augustine accepted this faith around the age of 18 and immediately began talking about it to those closest to him. So although he downplays this in the Confessions, Augustine was quite persuasive and even got Romanianus, his chief financial patron, to also accept Manichaeism. And so Augustine was in a sense, at the center of a Manichaean circle. And these Manichaean connections would eventually prove essential as Augustine moved up through the Roman social system. So again, we'll go back to our map of the Western Roman Empire. If you plot where Augustine is, Augustine studied in Carthage, and then after he finished school, he got a teaching position in Carthage. And then he moved on to the city of Rome, the biggest city in the Western Empire. And then in 384, he was selected for a chair of rhetoric in the city of Milan. And so if you look at this map, if you go to the top of the map, right where that sort of salmon and that battleship gray meet, you see the city of Milan. And that's where Augustine got his imperial chair of rhetoric. But that position is a big deal because that is the very sort of position for which a professor is paid in solidi. The professor is also given the proceeds of a specific imperial estate. The person is now extremely influential figure because Milan at that moment in 384 was the imperial residence. The emperor was staying in the city because it was nearer to the site of a civil war, and this meant that as the official professor of rhetoric in the city, Augustine would have regular access to the imperial court. A key advantage, since the emperor in question actually was a child, and the court made most of the decisions for him. And so Augustine is in the center of the Western imperial universe at that moment. And this was a position that Augustine got because of his network of Manichaean friends. And this is because Milan in 384 was the site of a major standoff between two different groups of Christians that affected every decision that was being made in the city at the time. And so the choice of a non-Christian for a position as influential as that of the city's professor of rhetoric was natural because it removed one thing that people might want to fight about. What it meant, though, is that Augustine had risen to the peak of his profession as a Manichae, and everybody knew about these connections. And we actually know about the process in which this occurred. The opening for the chair of rhetoric was announced, and because they knew that no Christian from either one of these warring sects really could be chosen for this, and no Christian who was involved with these warring sects really wanted to be involved in the decision making, the decision about who would hold this position was entrusted to a pagan senator in the city of Rome named Symmachus. And Augustine was recommended to Symmachus by one of his Manichaean associates. And so a pagan senator in the city of Rome chose the Manichaean rhetorician Augustine to go and serve as the imperial chair of rhetoric in the city of Milan, in part because both Christian sects had given up the opportunity to pick someone of their own. But at the same time that Augustine is ascending the professional ladder, and remember, he gets this chair of rhetoric at age 30. This is very, very young to have a position that's this important. He's also emerging personally. And so at the age of 17, Augustine had met a woman in North Africa. And although the Confessions very clearly downplays this, Augustine very much loved this woman. He stayed with her for 10 years. She bore him a son, and he recognized the son as his own, naming him Adeodatus, or the gift from God. But Augustine didn't marry this woman. But we have to also remember what marriage meant in the 4th century. Marriage is a tool for social advancement. It's not a pairing of a man and woman that reflects their love for each other. And for someone like Augustine, who is very much a social climber, he has a very good opportunity to marry into a family that has good social position and maybe a lot of money, but is kind of doesn't really have a lot of talent coming through its ranks at the moment. And so someone like Augustine, who is a rising star, has the opportunity to marry into the Roman upper class and solidify his status as a member of the elite. And the trade here is quite obvious. The other family exchanges its wealth and privilege for Augustine's talent. And the blending revitalizes that family while sort of propelling Augustine forward. And this is where Augustine was. He couldn't marry this woman that he met when he was 17 and was a nobody in North Africa. She was of, well, low birth, or at least lower birth than Augustine's horizons seemed to suggest would be a good match. And he couldn't afford to sacrifice the opportunity that a good marriage would bring. And so when he earned the professorship in Milan, He was ready to marry somebody of high social status, and so his mom found one of these prominent, wealthy, elite Roman families or Italian families that was kind of not kind of suffering from a talent shortage. And she arranged a marriage of Augustine, who at this point was 30, to a 12-year-old, the 12-year-old daughter of one of these families. This would have set up Augustine for life, and Augustine played his part. He dropped his first love, he sent her away, and he moved on to begin the process of organizing the marriage to this girl, and when she was of age, Augustine would have married her. And so by 385, Augustine had now truly made it in 4th century terms. He had a good job, he had access to the emperor, he had a prominent position, he had money, and he was engaged to an heiress. And so what happens next is something that is shocking, very surprising. Like Antony, like those Roman officials in Trier, Augustine gave it all up. What seems to have precipitated this initially was an illness that made it impossible for him to teach. A kind of, it seems like almost a laryngitis. But other teachers had had similar things happen, and they had managed to hang on. For Augustine, though, this illness sparked a radical decision to embrace the Christian counterculture. He abandoned Milan, he gave up his professorship, he broke off the engagement, and this was no small thing. To break off an engagement of that sort would have meant that he needed to pay a settlement to the girl's family, and he would have made lifelong enemies out of that family. But Augustine moved back to North Africa, and he set up a sort of monastic retreat for himself and some friends. He was eventually made a priest in 391, and then he was promoted to bishop of the city of Hippo, one of the larger cities in North Africa, in 395. And the Confessions follow 2 years later. Now, a lot of people read the Confessions as an autobiography of Augustine, but it's really something different. What the Confessions represents is an explanation of his choices. And so there's 2 things that Augustine really needed to explain. The first of these is he needed to defend himself against the suspicion that he was still on some level a Manichae. And some of this had to do with his biography. He was, of course, very prominently and publicly a Manichae. But by 397, he'd been a baptized Christian for just about as much time as he'd been a Manichae. At the same time, though, this radical dropping away of his lifelong goal of achieving a chair of rhetoric, the rapidness with which he turned away from wealth and privilege and power, this looked suspiciously Manichaean to people. It looked too extreme. Because people knew that Manichaeans believed that there was a stark contrast between good and evil, between worldliness and divine, between light and dark, and Augustine's break with the world looked radical. He seemed to have given everything up at once, and it seemed like too much. And the Confessions is then an explanation of how, in Christian terms, Augustine's abandonment of the 4th century rat race and all the rewards it promised made sense. It argues that this isn't a Manichaean overreaction to the world, but a true form of Christian wisdom, a Christian wisdom that he gradually came to appreciate, and then once he appreciated it, he embraced it, like that of Antony, and following the path similar to what you see with Antony. But the Confessions not only argues that this step makes sense for Christians, it also argues that this is what Christians really ought to be doing if they want to be leaders in the church. And so the Confessions then is a recounting of Augustine's story, but it's a recounting that is making an argument. It's making an argument that the choices he made were good, they were rational, they made sense, and they also are things that others should be aware of and embrace if they are able to.